when the Sisters of Our Lady of Charity decided to sell some land they owned in Dublin, Ireland, to pay their debts in 1992, the nuns followed the proper procedures. They petitioned officials for permission to move the bodies of women buried in the cemetery at their Donnybrook laundry, which between 1837 and 1992 served as a workhouse and home for fallen women. But the cemetery at Donnybrook was no ordinary resting place. It was a mass grave. Inside were the bodies of scores of unknown women, the undocumented, uncared about inmates of one of Ireland's notorious Magdalene Laundries. Their lives, and later their deaths, had been shrouded in secrecy. For more than 2 centuries, women in Ireland were sent to institutions like Donnybrook as a punishment for having sex outside of marriage. Unwed mothers, flirtatious women and others deemed unfit for society were forced to labour under the strict supervision of nuns for months or years, sometimes even for life. When the mass grave at Donnybrook was discovered, the 155 unmarked tombs touched off a scandal that exposed the extent and horrors of the Magdalene Laundries. As women came forward to share their experiences of being held against their will in restrictive workhouses, the Irish public reacted with outrage. When the Magdalene movement first took hold in the mid-18th century, the campaign to put fallen women to work was supported by both the Catholic and Protestant churches, with women serving short terms inside the asylums with the goal of rehabilitation. Over the years, however, the Magdalene Laundries, named for the biblical figure Mary Magdalene, became primarily Catholic institutions, and the stints grew longer and longer. Women sent there were often charged with redeeming themselves through lace-making, needlework or doing laundry. Ireland's first such institution, the Magdalene Asylum for penitent females in Dublin, was founded by the Protestant Church of Ireland in 1765. At the time, there was a worry that prostitution in Irish cities was on the rise, and that wayward women who had been seduced, had sex outside of marriage, or gotten pregnant out of wedlock were susceptible to becoming prostitutes. Soon, parents began to send their unmarried daughters to the institutions to hide their pregnancies, so that the family shouldn't be embarrassed. But over time, the institutions became more like prisons, with many different groups of women being rotated through the system, sometimes by the Irish government. There were inmates imported from psychiatric institutions and jails, women with special needs, victims of rape and sexual assault, pregnant teenagers sent there by their parents, again to hide their shame, and girls deemed too flirtatious or tempting to men. Others were there too, for no obvious reason. Though the institutions were run by Catholic orders, they were supported by the Irish government, which funnelled money towards the system in exchange for laundry services. Confined for decades on end and isolated from their families and society at large, many of these women became institutionalised over time and therefore became utterly dependent on the relevant convents and unfit to re-enter society unaided. The girls and women were forced to work from morning until evening, washing, ironing and packing laundry, and sewing, embroidering or doing other manual labour. These laundries were run on a commercial for-profit basis, but the girls and women received no pay. No contributions or stamps were paid on their behalf to statutory pension schemes. The laundry they washed came not only from members of the public, local businesses and religious institutions, but also from numerous government departments, the defence forces, public hospitals, public schools, prisons and other state entities such as the Parliament. Now the girls were treated terribly. Their hair was cut and their clothes were taken away and replaced with a drab uniform. A rule of silence was imposed at almost all times in Magdalene Laundries, and in many women's experiences, friendships were forbidden. Correspondence with the outside was often intercepted or forbidden. Visits by friends or family were not encouraged and were monitored by nuns when they did occur. Often women's names were stripped from them, and they were referred to by numbers or as child or penitent. Some inmates, often orphans or victims of rape or abuse, stayed there for a lifetime. Others escaped and were brought straight back to the institutions. Punishments for refusal to work included deprivation of meals, solitary confinement, physical abuse, forced kneeling for long periods on stone floors, or humiliation rituals, including shaving of hair and enduring ice baths for long periods. Survivors speak of constantly being under surveillance, being verbally insulted, feeling cold, having a poor diet and enduring humiliating and inadequate hygiene conditions. None of the girls received an education, and survivors dwell on this fact as determining their loss of opportunity in later life. It was common for the girls and women to believe that they would die inside the institution, and of course many of them did. Some pregnant women were transferred to homes for unwed mothers, where they bore and temporarily lived with their babies and worked in conditions similar to those of the laundries. Babies were usually taken from their mothers and handed over to other families. In one of the most notorious homes, the Bon Secours mother and baby home in Tuam, scores of babies died. In 2014, the remains of at least 796 babies were found in a septic tank in the home's yard. Some women were fortunate enough to have family members track them down and take them out, but most of them were not. According to one of the 277 Magdalene survivors, the laundries would send a faulty report home informing the parents of how the child was doing in school or behaviourally. These women report that they were never taught anything school-related. They were condemned to work. Estimates of the number of women who went through Irish Magdalene Laundries vary, and most religious orders have refused to provide archival information for investigators and historians. But up to 300,000 women are thought to have passed through the laundries in total, at least 10,000 of them since 1922. But despite a large number of survivors, the laundries went unchallenged until the 1990s. So how did such an abusive system endure for 231 years in Ireland? Well, to start with, any talk of harsh treatment at the Magdalene Laundries and mothers' homes tended to be dismissed by the public, since the institutions were run by religious orders. Survivors who told others what they had been through were often shamed by their families or ignored. Such was the power of the church over the lives of the population. Other women were too embarrassed to talk about their past and never told anyone about their experiences. Details on both the inmates and their lives are scant. Since 2001, the Irish government has acknowledged that women in the Magdalene Laundries were victims of abuse. However, the Irish government resisted calls for investigation and proposals for compensation. It was only in 2013 that the then Prime Minister Enda Kenny apologised directly in Parliament to those affected. It's regularly said that these nuns weren't trying to torture these women. They were trying to show them the difference between right and wrong so they wouldn't be prostitutes or thieves. But the nuns enjoyed the sadism, and many relished their power to torture with impunity. The laundries were named as the Magdalene Laundries after the biblical figure Mary Magdalene, who was wrongly portrayed as a prostitute by 4th century Bible composers. Magdalene survivors and their family members fall into 5 main categories. Firstly, those who have spoken out and demanded justice. Secondly, those who continue to live in silence. Thirdly, women who are still living in institutional settings under the control of religious orders. Fourthly, those who died both inside and outside the laundry. And finally, the family members of women incarcerated in the laundries, including adopted people. When the doors of the last laundry closed in 1996, the Irish government refused to give the women an apology or compensation for their work. Can anyone tell me why any religion could inflict such torture, cruelty, abuse, humiliation, degradation, and slavery, yes, slavery, whilst the population remained faithful and loyal to it rather than their children?